precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on.
He and my mother got married after the war, and I never, ever, ever, ever saw my father cry, ever, except for one time. And I'll never forget that day because it terrified me. We lived in a house that he built with a GI Bill, and it wasn't an overly fancy house, but I remember the countertops. My mother still lives in there today, because they were yellow Formica laminate. And we had a tiny little black and white television on top of the counter. And I remember the day that Dr. King was assassinated, and the footage you just saw. I'll never forget that. But what I mostly won't forget is looking at my father put his elbows on the counter and begin to cry. Now he's gone, but I remembered how much Dr. King meant to them, and although I was only 8 years old when he was assassinated, I remembered that day. So I called my mother, because there was a lot of things to be afraid of then. I was so young, I didn't understand it. I didn't understand when we were driving. We lived in the Midwest, and we were driving to upstate New York, and my father had a job, my mother had a job, and they were, you know, people always dressed well then. They didn't matter whether they had money or not. They always had clean clothes and nice shoes and pocketbook, as they called it. And remember, I had to go to the bathroom. I couldn't go to the bathroom. They kept saying, we can't stop here, we can't stop there, we can't stop. I kept saying, well, why, you know, and I was, anyway, they said, we can't go there. And at that time, people were Negroes. And my mother had a pot in the car. We had to pull the side of the road, and I had to urinate in a pot, because that's just the way it was. Yeah. So I asked my mother what she could remember, because my father knew Daddy King. I knew that Martin Luther King spent a lot of time in the city where I grew up. So she said Dr. King had many friends in the Cleveland area, including church leaders, graduates of Morehouse College, and other professionals and non-professionals. He was invited to speak here often at churches, large and small, black and white, where he preached his message of love and nonviolence. Rallies were held throughout the Cleveland area to promote integration and to end discrimination in business and education and housing and employment. Now, she refers to her friend, but it was actually my aunt. My friend and I tried to hear him wherever he spoke. The newspapers showed pictures of violent encounters between blacks and whites, while Dr. King continued to preach nonviolence and love. And although Cleveland is a northern state, prejudice and discrimination persisted. When the March on Washington was announced, my best friend and her husband and I made the decision to go. Our husbands were cousins, and they both had new jobs, and at the time, they had 6 children between themselves. Some of our friends and relatives were fearful for us. Some gave encouragement, and a few thought we were just nuts. But we felt that this was something we had to do for ourselves, and more importantly, a legacy for our children. Hopefully, they would have more opportunities and less racial humiliation than we, the parents, had experienced. We left our young families with in-laws and boarded the bus. Friends were there to see us off and wish us well. After midnight, a driver made a rest stop at a plaza in a mountainous area along the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Most went inside, but I did not. I heard voices coming from a distance, and the voices echoed throughout the still night. I assumed it was a bus of African Americans singing in beautiful harmony. We shall overcome. When the bus unloaded, I was surprised when I saw that all the people on the bus were white. They too were going to the March on Washington. It reinforced what I already knew, that there is good and there is bad in all groups. And we can live together in love, respect, and peace as held forth by Dr. King. On arriving in D.C., buses pulled up from all over the country, and after a boxed meal, we joined the march and somehow made our way to the reflection pool where we dangled our tired feet in the water and listened to the I Have a Dream speech by Dr. King and others. And I distinctly remember hearing Mahalia Jackson sing. Aside from the birth of my 3 daughters, going to the march was the most meaningful event in my life. It gave me new hope for my children and my grandchildren, but it also gave me forgiveness for those who practiced hate, discrimination, and name-calling of a little black girl who went to an all-white school. That's for my mother.
And